For 7 years, the narrow gravel driveway was my only access to my property, cutting between my land and the neighboring house owned by a woman everyone in the area quietly called the Queen of Control. When I first bought my land, the previous owner told me the driveway had always been shared informally. There were no arguments, no fences, and no problems. But a month after I moved in, she installed a heavy metal gate across the path, locked it, and calmly told me that if I wanted to pass, I needed her permission. Every single time after that. At first, I assumed it was temporary and tried to stay polite. I knocked on her door, introduced myself, and asked if we could work out a simple access agreement. She smiled in a way that never reached her eyes and handed me a printed list of rules instead. She wanted scheduled driving hours, written requests before visitors arrived, and even demanded I notify her before bringing contractors onto my own property. When I questioned her authority, she calmly said she controlled the driveway because it crossed a small corner of her land, and she intended to enforce it fully. Over time, the rules became punishments. She would lock the gate randomly, sometimes early mornings when I needed to leave for work, other times late at night when I returned home. Deliveries were turned away, repair crews refused to come back, and friends stopped visiting because they didn't want to argue with her. Every conversation with her felt rehearsed, like she enjoyed reminding me that she held control over my only exit. I checked property records and learned the driveway boundary situation was complicated, but nothing clearly stated she had exclusive control over the entire access route at all, legally. I tried hiring a surveyor, hoping official measurements would solve the dispute peacefully. The survey confirmed that while a small strip of the driveway touched her property, most of the route ran directly across mine. When I showed her the findings, she barely glanced at the paperwork before dismissing it. She told me surveys didn't matter because she had used the driveway longer than I had owned my land. Then she hinted that if I pushed the issue, she would involve local authorities and claim trespassing every time I crossed her section of gravel during any daily routine travel whatsoever. The intimidation worked for a while. I adjusted my schedule, avoided confrontation, and documented every incident quietly. I installed cameras near the driveway entrance, saved text messages, and kept a detailed log of every time she blocked access. Months turned into years, and the pattern never changed. What frustrated me most wasn't the inconvenience, but her confidence that she could control someone else's property indefinitely. She waved at neighbors like she was protecting the community, while privately making my life harder with restrictions she had no clear legal right to enforce against any property ownership protections whatsoever, ever at all. The breaking point came on a rainy afternoon when she locked the gate again while I was returning from town with building supplies. I sat in my truck watching water pool around the gravel while she stood on her porch pretending not to notice me. Something shifted in that moment. I realized I had spent years reacting to her rules instead of questioning them fully. That evening, I reopened my property files and started researching easement law, land transfers, and historical parcel divisions. What I discovered suggested there might be a permanent solution she never considered possible before, legally, anywhere. Once I started digging into property law, I realized the situation was far more complex and far more hopeful than I had believed during those years of frustration. The survey results sat on my desk alongside old county maps, archived parcel records, and handwritten transfer documents dating back decades. At first glance, everything looked confusing, but one detail kept appearing repeatedly. The driveway had changed ownership multiple times throughout the past 70 years. And each time, pieces of it were divided, merged, or sold separately from the homes surrounding it. I contacted the county records office and requested every historical document tied to the driveway parcel number. The clerk seemed surprised anyone would ask for records that old, but within a few days, she handed me copies of property transfers, zoning notes, and subdivision approvals. Late that night, while reviewing those papers, I noticed something that made me sit upright. The small strip of land my neighbor claimed gave her control over the driveway wasn't actually attached to her main property title the way she believed. It had been sold separately decades ago to a third party who never developed the land. Curious, I tracked down the ownership status of that forgotten strip. It turned out the parcel still existed independently, listed under the name of an investment company that had dissolved nearly 20 years earlier. The tax records showed unpaid balances piling up year after year. That meant the land could potentially be purchased if the county auctioned it for delinquent taxes. The realization hit me slowly, then all at once. The very section of driveway she used to control me might not even legally belong to her at all. I didn't celebrate or jump to conclusions. Instead, I hired a real estate attorney experienced in easement disputes and land recovery cases. During our first meeting, I laid out 7 years of documentation, blocked access logs, camera footage, survey reports, and property records. He listened carefully, occasionally nodding while flipping through the evidence. When he reached the old parcel ownership papers, he leaned back and said something that felt like the first real validation I'd heard in years. He explained that if the parcel truly remained separate and delinquent, I could legally attempt to purchase it before anyone else noticed. The process wasn't simple. The county required verification of tax default, notification attempts to previous ownership entities, and formal bidding procedures. Weeks passed while paperwork moved through administrative departments. Meanwhile, my neighbor continued her routine. She locked the gate whenever she felt like it, occasionally watching me park at the entrance and walk the remaining distance to my house in bad weather. She seemed completely confident that her control would never be challenged. During one particularly tense afternoon, she approached me while I was unloading groceries and casually reminded me that I should respect property boundaries. Her tone carried the same rehearsed authority she had used for years. I simply nodded, keeping my response neutral. Inside, though, I felt something new, patience mixed with certainty. I knew she was standing on a claim that might soon disappear entirely. 3 months after I submitted my application, I received a certified letter from the county tax office. It confirmed that the driveway parcel would be auctioned due to unresolved tax debt and abandonment. My attorney immediately prepared the bidding paperwork and advised me to remain quiet about the process. If my neighbor discovered the auction beforehand, she could attempt to purchase the parcel herself or pressure the county to delay the sale. Auction day arrived without drama. The parcel was small, oddly shaped, and technically classified as a utility access strip. Only 2 bidders registered interest, myself and a representative from a minor land investment group. The bidding lasted less than 10 minutes. When the final amount was accepted, I stared at the confirmation document, realizing I had just legally acquired the exact piece of land my neighbor relied on to maintain her control over my access. I didn't rush to celebrate. Instead, I worked with my attorney to finalize the transfer, record the deed, and confirm the boundaries with an updated professional survey. Everything had to be perfect, legally airtight, and fully documented. Because once the paperwork was complete, the balance of power between us wouldn't just shift slightly. It would flip completely. The deed transfer finalized on a quiet Tuesday morning. There was no celebration, no dramatic moment, just an official stamp from the county clerk and a notarized confirmation that the forgotten driveway parcel was now legally mine. I held the document longer than necessary, reading every line twice, making sure there were no errors, no hidden conditions, nothing that could unravel what had taken months of research and patience to achieve. My attorney advised me not to act emotionally or impulsively. He explained that ownership alone didn't instantly change access rights, especially in long-standing shared-use areas. The smartest approach, he said, was to establish clear legal boundaries and formalize driveway use with written agreements. In other words, I now held the authority she once believed belonged to her, but how I used it would determine whether the situation ended in chaos or resolution. The first step was installing updated survey markers along the newly acquired parcel. A licensed survey team arrived early one morning, placing bright boundary stakes and recording GPS coordinates. I noticed my neighbor watching from her porch, arms folded, confusion replacing her usual confident posture. She walked halfway down her yard but stopped when she saw the surveyors reviewing documents and measuring distances carefully. I could almost see the moment she realized something significant was happening without her control or permission. Later that afternoon, I received a text message from her asking why surveyors were trespassing near her driveway. I responded calmly, attaching a scanned copy of the newly recorded deed along with the updated survey map. I didn't include commentary or confrontation, just factual documentation. 10 minutes passed before she replied with a single sentence claiming the paperwork had to be incorrect. I didn't respond again, knowing legal clarity would speak louder than any argument. Within 2 days, I scheduled a meeting with my attorney to draft a formal driveway access agreement. The document outlined usage rights, maintenance responsibilities, and reasonable access expectations for both properties. The language was fair, balanced, and designed to prevent future disputes. My attorney explained that offering her structured access would demonstrate good faith if any conflict escalated legally. It also placed responsibility back on her to either cooperate or risk losing consistent driveway use entirely. When the agreement was delivered to her through certified mail, her reaction came quickly. She appeared at my property entrance the following morning, holding the envelope and demanding an explanation. For the first time in 7 years, her voice carried uncertainty instead of authority. She insisted she had always controlled the driveway and claimed I was attempting to intimidate her. I calmly explained that ownership records had changed and that the agreement simply ensured both properties maintained safe, predictable access moving forward. She refused to sign the document immediately, stating she needed time to review with her own advisors. I nodded, expecting resistance. What mattered was that the balance of control had shifted entirely. She could no longer lock the gate or dictate access schedules without owner's consent. The driveway wasn't hers to manage alone anymore, legally or practically. Over the next few weeks, something unexpected happened. The gate she had relied on for years remained unlocked. Delivery trucks returned without interference. Contractors accepted jobs on my property again. Even neighbors began commenting quietly about how peaceful the area suddenly felt without constant tension surrounding driveway access. The absence of conflict felt almost unfamiliar after so many years of careful documentation and silent frustration. But the true turning point arrived when her attorney contacted mine requesting a meeting to discuss the agreement terms. The tone of the letter was professional, cautious, and noticeably respectful. It acknowledged my legal ownership of the parcel and proposed minor adjustments to maintenance cost sharing. When my attorney showed me the letter, he smiled slightly and said something that perfectly captured the situation. He explained that once control shifts through proper legal channels, even the most confident disputes often resolve themselves quietly. I agreed to the meeting, not out of victory, but because closure required cooperation. For the first time, the driveway wasn't a battleground. It was simply shared land again. The meeting with her attorney was scheduled for a Friday morning at a small real estate mediation office halfway between our properties. I arrived early with my attorney, carrying every document we had prepared: surveys, purchase records, historical parcel transfers, and the proposed driveway agreement. The atmosphere felt professional but tense, like everyone understood that this conversation would decide whether the conflict finally ended or expanded into something far more expensive and exhausting for both sides. She arrived 10 minutes late, walking in with the same composed posture she had used for years, though the confidence seemed thinner now. She avoided eye contact with me and sat beside her attorney, placing a folder on the table without opening it. The mediator introduced everyone, explained the purpose of the session, and asked both parties to focus on practical solutions instead of personal history. It was the first time in 7 years that the dispute was being handled in a structured legal environment rather than through locked gates and hallway confrontations. My attorney began by presenting the updated ownership documents. He explained clearly that the parcel purchase had been completed through county auction, properly recorded and confirmed by 2 independent surveys. He emphasized that the goal wasn't to remove her access entirely, but to establish fair and predictable usage rules protecting both properties from future disputes. The mediator nodded as he reviewed the paperwork, occasionally asking clarifying questions about maintenance costs and emergency vehicle access requirements. Her attorney responded carefully, acknowledging the ownership transfer while arguing that long-term usage patterns created expectations of shared access. He asked whether I intended to restrict her ability to use the driveway moving forward. Before my attorney could answer, I spoke calmly, explaining that my only goal was consistency. I described the years of blocked access, lost deliveries, and unpredictable restrictions I had documented. I made it clear that I was offering the agreement specifically to prevent either of us from repeating those mistakes. The room stayed quiet for several seconds after I finished speaking. She shifted in her chair, flipping through the agreement pages slowly. For the first time, her tone softened when she spoke. She said she believed she had been protecting her property rights and never expected the situation to escalate into a land purchase. The statement didn't sound like an apology, but it was the closest acknowledgement of reality she had offered since the conflict began. The mediator suggested a short break to allow both sides to review minor revisions proposed by her attorney. During that pause, my attorney explained that her willingness to negotiate meant the dispute was essentially resolved. All that remained was refining maintenance responsibilities, clarifying seasonal usage rules, and establishing communication procedures for construction or heavy vehicle traffic. None of those terms threatened access for either property. They simply formalized expectations. When the meeting resumed, both attorneys reviewed the updated draft line by line. The final agreement guaranteed unrestricted daily access for both properties, established shared maintenance costs based on driveway usage percentages, and prohibited either party from installing gates or barriers without mutual written consent. It also included a dispute resolution clause requiring mediation before any legal action could be filed in the future. She hesitated before signing. The pen hovered above the signature line while she reread the first page carefully. Then, without looking up, she signed her name, slid the document across the table, and quietly said she hoped the situation could remain civil moving forward. I signed immediately after, understanding that the conflict which had dominated 7 years of my life had just ended in a single controlled moment. Outside the office, the air felt unusually calm. There were no arguments, no threats, and no locked gates waiting at the end of the driveway. Just a legal agreement supported by clear ownership and mutual responsibility. For the first time since I moved onto my property, access to my own land felt permanent, predictable, and protected by law rather than personal tolerance. But the story still wasn't finished. Because real closure wasn't about winning the driveway dispute. It was about what happened next, once control finally disappeared. The first morning after the agreement was finalized, I drove down the driveway without hesitation for the first time in years. It sounds simple, almost unremarkable, but that quiet drive felt completely different. There was no anxiety about whether the gate would be locked, no need to check my phone for sudden messages, and no fear of confrontation waiting at the exit. The gravel crunched beneath my tires in the same familiar rhythm, but the tension that had followed every trip was finally gone. Over the next few weeks, the changes became noticeable across the entire neighborhood. Delivery trucks arrived without turning around halfway. Contractors completed projects without scheduling around unpredictable access rules. Even utility workers commented on how much easier it was to reach both properties now that the driveway remained consistently open. Something as simple as predictable access had quietly restored normal routines for multiple households, not just mine. My neighbor kept her distance at first. She stayed polite but reserved whenever we crossed paths. The dramatic authority she once carried had been replaced by cautious neutrality. I understood that adjusting to the loss of control wasn't easy, especially after years of believing she had complete authority over the driveway. But over time, small gestures began replacing old tensions. She notified me before scheduling heavy maintenance vehicles, and I responded with the same courtesy when contractors needed extended driveway use. The agreement that once felt like a legal necessity gradually became a practical framework for peaceful coexistence. Financially, the outcome surprised me as well. The property value of my land increased significantly once permanent access was legally secured. Real estate agents explained that uncertainty surrounding entry rights often discourages buyers and lowers property estimates. By resolving the dispute through ownership and formal agreements, the land became far more attractive from an investment standpoint. What began as a defensive decision turned into one of the most beneficial property improvements I had ever made. The emotional impact, though, mattered even more than the financial one. For 7 years, I had structured my daily life around someone else's unpredictable decisions. Every delayed delivery, canceled visit, and interrupted workday slowly built frustration I didn't fully recognize until it disappeared. The absence of constant tension created a sense of relief I hadn't experienced since moving onto the property. Peace returned gradually, replacing years of quiet stress with something far more valuable than convenience: stability. Months later, we both attended a small community meeting organized to discuss local road maintenance. She sat across the room, listening quietly instead of leading discussions the way she once dominated conversations. At one point, she spoke briefly about the importance of clear property agreements and mutual respect between neighbors. The statement was simple, but it carried an understanding that hadn't existed before the dispute was resolved. It felt like the final sign that the conflict had truly ended, not just legally, but personally. Looking back, I realized the biggest lesson wasn't about winning or losing. It was about patience, documentation, and understanding property law instead of reacting emotionally. For years, I believed the situation was permanent because it had lasted so long. But research, professional advice, and careful timing changed everything without unnecessary confrontation. Control built on assumption often collapses when faced with legal clarity and documented ownership. She once believed the driveway gave her permanent power over my property access. The truth was that power existed only because no one had questioned it thoroughly. The moment ownership records changed, the entire balance shifted quietly but permanently. There were no dramatic arguments, no public scenes, just paperwork, patience, and a solution she never expected. Now, every time I drive across that gravel path, it reminds me of something simple but powerful. Property isn't just land and boundaries. It's security, independence, and peace of mind. And sometimes, ending a conflict doesn't require confrontation at all. Sometimes, it just requires buying the driveway.